Hi, Charles. Welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you today. A fellow education advocate, somebody who has a lot more education experience than I do, particularly in working with really kind of young students. So I'm really excited to have this chat with you. Welcome to the show.
Well, Elena, thank you for having me. I always enjoy connecting with fellow educators and, just talking about the work that we're doing. So thank you for allowing me to be in this space with you.
Absolutely. So we're both quite passionate about education. I think we can have a really nice discussion. But before we go into the kind of the meat of it, I wanted to ask you just share a little bit about how did you come around to being in education. I know you're a sort of person who's very curious and you're doing a lot of different things in addition to your actual role. So talk to us a little bit about how did you get into education? Why education?
Yeah, so I always chuckle when people ask me this story, especially some of my new teachers, because I think they're waiting to hear that story, right? Like, oh, I always wanted to be a teacher or an educator. And that was not the case. I fell into it. I didn't go to school for education. I went to school, I majored in communication and public relations. And I was doing that work actually for a school district. And they asked me if I could teach an English class. I said, sure, why not? And absolutely fell in love with it. So I went back to school, got my master's in teaching, and I just was really striving to be the best that I possibly could. And over time, I think I started to see a lot of the inequities and the issues within education, realized I could do a little bit from my classroom, but wanted to do a lot more. So I pursued the administrative role. So I went back to school, got a master's in administration, and I have been a principal now, in for the last I don't know, 8 or so years. Um, and just really, as you mentioned earlier, just reaching out even beyond that. I have my own podcast. I am a co-host of a show. I have just co-authored a book. I speak at workshops. I mean, at conferences, and I host workshops through my consulting business. So, just this desire to make as big of an impact in the world of education that I can before my time here is done.
I love it. You're a very multidimensional individual. So to actually pick up on that real quick before I lose my track of thought, um, having said what you just said in terms of somebody who's very diverse in his experience, who is obviously very curious and kind of has a lot to share and a lot of value to add, how do you see our education system, or is our education system right now is able to offer our youth opportunities to be able to explore these different avenues?
That's a great question, right? And I think that we should be going down that route. We need this shift from students to be consumers to be creators. And I think that if we move beyond just giving information, giving knowledge or whatever it may be, and saying, what can you do with this information? How can you go out there and contribute to the world? The world is a vastly different place from when I was in school. We didn't, not everybody had an opportunity to share their voice with the world, and so now students have that, right, through social media, through podcasts, through whatever it may be. They have so many opportunities to share with the world. And so instead of fighting back against that, instead of saying, well, that shouldn't be the case, it's how can we make sure that they are productive members in those areas? How can we make sure that they're contributing and giving back? My biggest thing that I talk about is telling your own story, right? I've worked in urban education. I was one of those students, and the reality is, if you don't tell your story, someone else will. And more than often, it's not a great portrayal of who you are. So students have to realize that not only do they have a voice, but now more than ever, there are spaces and platforms where they can utilize that voice to tell their stories. And so, yeah, absolutely. Going back to your original question, there needs to be a shift away from just being a consumer of information, right? My general rule is, like, if I can Google it, it shouldn't be on a test, right? Like, so how can I take information and turn it into something different, turn it into something new, and amplify the voice that I have? And that, I believe anyway, is what we should be pushing forwards to with our students.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, it just sounds like from what you're saying is that it's almost like we have to teach, you know, the future generation how to learn, how to be continuous learners, and how to essentially just be those critical thinkers, and just really keep up with everything that's happening in the world. I mean, I mean, education sector in general is just moving so fast. The world of work is moving so fast, and there's continuous discussion about the big gap that it keeps widening between, you know, university or school studies and then also the world of work. So, and I'm just curious, like right now in the corporate world where I've kind of transitioned to after spending some time in education, the big push is of course for the human skills, right? So
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
that emotional intelligence, that really just managing our time in a world where we're just distracted. So I'm curious, you know, because you work, so talk to me a little bit about the age group that you work with, number one, and two, you know, what have you seen done in terms of educating the youth with these human skills versus just preparing them for tests and these things?
Yeah, so I'm a principal in Chicago. So my students are in grades K through 8. So I have babies all the way up to the fun middle schoolers. And so you you know, SEL is critical, right? I mean, if we're going to kind of bundle it into a simple thing, when and I say that because when I joined my school 6 years ago, my school was slated to shut down. They gave me the arduous task of keeping the school open, and I'll admit, my very first year in, I did everything that I thought I was supposed to do. Right? We changed curriculum, we hired different teachers, we did everything that a textbook would tell you to do, and I was overly confident at the end of that year that I would see these drastic shifts. And at the end of the year, nothing happened. None of our data moved. So that summer, we looked at a survey that we had, and we quickly realized that none of our students, none of our staff members were happy. They didn't want to be at the school. They didn't feel safe at the school. They didn't feel involved at the school. And it was like a light bulb moment. And so we spent the next few years focusing on that. How do we make people feel comfortable? How do we make people want to be in a space? And we didn't really focus on all the other things, right? We didn't change our approach to ELA or math or anything else. We just really pushed into the SEL spectrum. And within a year or two, we started to see massive shifts. I remember we had one of the highest attendance ratings in the entire city of Chicago. And they were asking me, like, what was your secret, right? What did you do? And I said, well, I just made the school a place where people wanted to be. And obviously there's a trickle effect. If students are in school more, there's more learning taking place. If students and staff feel comfortable with one another, relationships are being built, and with that, more learning is taking place. And so it wasn't just pushing learning. We had to focus on these other areas, those soft skills, as you talked about, right? So that way students were ready to learn. And we talk a lot about trauma in the brain, and the students that I have, there's a lot of trauma, right, in a lot of these urban areas, and I mean not just urban and all over, but there's a lot of trauma, and we can't ignore those things. We can't ignore how it shapes, how learning takes place, the biological impacts. And so we even did a lot of studies on that brain-based learning. So that way, when we have, for example, if two of our students get into an argument in the classroom and those students are removed, you can't just jump back into a lesson, right? Students, their flight or fight is triggered, right? They're not in a state to learn, they're in a state of survival, right? So how do we bring them back into a space so that they're ready to learn again? And so it was a lot of those tactics, and I guess, again, as you mentioned, those soft skills, which has changed everything.
Mm. And just for our listeners who are not familiar with SEL, it's social emotional learning. So that's what he's referring to. Um, to also to kind of pick up on the brain science. So in the work that we do with Western in our ed tech company, we focus very much on how essentially, just behavior science. How is it that our brain affects the way we learn? And I think it's quite similar across board for us at the different stages in our lives. But what has been your biggest finding, or what do you feel more people would know about, the way brain processes learning? Or maybe the parents, for example, because I know this is something when we work with education institutions, one of the biggest challenges we have is really just not the challenges, but one of the biggest things we have to continuously kind of speak about is speaking to parents about the way students actually learn, and how learning is moving towards more personalized, individualized, etc. So from your experience, what has been the biggest learning for you, or for the work that you've done in brain science, as it relates to our brain?
Yeah, so I think that work is important because it really gives a why behind what we're doing.
Mm,
Uh, a lot of times, people, our parents or educators, they're accustomed to a certain way of doing school. And so when we begin to do these shifts, there's a lot of questions. Well, why are you doing that? That isn't how we did it. What, like why are we shifting all of these things? And I think when you dive into the science behind how our brains operate, how trauma impacts the brain, how our environments impact our biologies, it really begins to make sense. And so I had to do that first with my teachers. And so, for anybody listening, there's a book out there by Zaretta Hammond, right? Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And she does an amazing job of explaining how the different parts of the brain interact with one another, and how there are the different parts of the brain that get triggered depending on the situations that you're in, and how that impacts your learning. And so when you're able to simplify that and share that with your families, it begins to make a little more sense. Like, so for example, just this morning, we have Spirit Week going on. So today was team day, so kids could dress into their jerseys. And I have a very close relationship with all of our families. So about 7 in the morning, I have a parent calling me, and she's very upset. Well, my child said they're supposed to wear a jersey, that they have to wear a jersey. I said they don't have to, but they can.
mm,
And we're going back and forth, and she's telling me, well, she just told me, Mr. Williams, I don't have a jersey. Mom, that is okay. Don't worry about it. Then she puts the child on, and the child is crying, Mr. Williams, I want to wear a jersey. And I had to talk her down, but I also reminded mom, I said, Mom, think about how your child is going to come to school right now. They're upset. She's frustrated. She's not going to be in a space to learn. So I encouraged mom. I said, Mom, remember those things that we talked about? Do me a favor. We've got like an hour before classes start, right? Take some time, get her back into a space, right? And so when I saw her this morning,
oh, I think I lost you for just a second.
yeah, so when I saw her this morning, she had a smile on her face.
Mm,
And that made me excited because I knew mom took that time, and I don't think mom would have done that, would have bothered doing those things had we not had those conversations about, if your child comes to school in that state of mind, they're not going to be functional. She's not going to have a good day. And not only will she not learn, but she may find herself in conflict with other students. And so you're absolutely right. Like, we have to take the time to explain that. And for us, that book by Zaretta Hammond was a very simplified way of doing that. And it just made sense. So I did it with my teachers. They explained it to their students. We had a workshop with our parents. And again, it's just to make sure that everybody knows. And so now when a student finds themselves in conflict, it's not just about us saying, well, let's take a break, let's go take a walk. They understand why, right? I need to remove myself from the situation. These are things I need to do for myself so that way I can go back into the class and continue being successful. It's not just something we do without understanding the why behind it. So I just, yeah, for me, it's that piece. It's knowing the why behind the things that we're doing.
mm. No, that's very good. Yeah, and I think that's it's healthy to kind of question this continuously, and I think that's what, and we, I mean, we both know the education sector, particularly in the U.S. I mean, I've spent a lot of years working in the U.S. in education, and whether it's through K through 12 or higher education. It's a slow moving process. It's a
Hmm.
dinosaur of an
Hmm.
industry. Things take time. It's very bureaucratic. It's just very slow to change. If anything, again, one of the silver linings of everything that has happened to the world in the last, 18 plus months is the fact that it kind of pushed us out of our comfort zone, essentially, as
Hmm.
educators, as people, and let us reevaluate kind of what's important. And like you said, there's so much research now in the way our brain comprehends information, especially in a world where we're so continuously bombarded with information and there's just so many different ways to learn. How do you actually maintain that competitive edge as a school, an institution, or even a corporation, right? The next question would be, related to this. So looking at, what is the future of education might look like? What do you see are some trends? What, and if not no particular trends, what would you like to see in the future of education?
Yeah, so I love this question, because for me, I think one of the biggest things is a shift away from a transactional environment, right? I think most of the time now in school, kids go to school, they do assignments to get a grade, and that's what education is. That's in many cases that's what education is, but that isn't what it should be. So I would love to figure out, how do we get away from that? How do we get away from the whole concept of grades and honor systems and tracks and things like that? So that way I'm going to school in order to, as we kind of talked about earlier, to gain this information, to get these skills, so that way I could be creative with it. That way I can be a consumer and an active participant, in my world. And it's just, to me, it's sad that there's so much focus on, well, did I get an A? It's like, well, but did you learn it? Right? Yeah, you did the assignment, but do you understand what you were doing? Do you understand why this is important? Do you understand how this fits into a larger context? And I know I have these kind of conversations and to be honest, arguments with parents quite often, is that is what they want to focus on. Did my child make it on the honor roll? Right? Did my child get A's and not B's? And it's like, can you even tell me the difference between an A and a B? Like, well, they got more questions right. Well, yeah, but does that mean that they know more? Right? Like, there's so much more to education, but unfortunately, I believe, as we try in small pockets, we do things like standards based grading and, mastery learning. We do things like that, and that's great. But the reality is, the educational space on a much larger spectrum kind of needs to boil back down to, well, okay, well, yeah, you mastered it, so now you got a 4, right? And there we are, back to numbers again, because at some point, the reality is the rest of the system isn't there, and we have to kind of fall back in line with the rest of the system. But that, to me, that is something I think that would be empowering. I mean, I don't know about you, but in most spaces, right, where you're working, you're not really getting a grade, right? Like, you're doing the work, and you're trying to figure out, how can I become more innovative? How can I make this process better? How can I, and that is what you are encouraged to do. And I almost use the word graded, but um so that, for me, if there was one thing that could change in education, it would be that, it's just shift away from this transactional experience.
Yeah, and you're so spot on. I mean, having had experience kind of from education to, kind of high school students to then universities and corporates, I can definitely tell you there's a big disconnect and there's just a huge gap. Because when, it's funny because up until a certain age, like the age of 18, and even in universities, it's really all about that grade, right? It's all about the grade. It's all about how well you're doing. It's all about your GPA. And so many things depend on that. Yet by the time you get into an actual work environment, you almost need to transition yourself from being a student and a consumer to now being a producer of things, of results, ideas, innovations. And yet, and this is, I mean, it's just it's a $1 million question, right? It's like, why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep doing things, preparing the youth in one way, but then what we expect them to do in the world of work is completely different. So, it's like, there's certain curricula that needs to be followed, and etc. And that's all great. But in the, like you said, in the world of work, they have to actually come up with solutions. They have to be creative. They cannot just study and memorize and just aim to get a higher grade. It doesn't work like that. It's a very different world. So every time I have this conversation with somebody in the education field, I just frustrates me, because I'm like, why are we still doing things, that just don't make sense for the future of the individual's success, essentially, in the world of work. So yeah, no, it's a big problem.
Oh,
It's a big
yeah.
problem.
Well, I joke a lot, and maybe it's not a joke, but you know, I think one of the reasons we don't make those shifts, I mean, think about the companies that exist that profit massively off of these systems,
Of
right?
course.
I mean, you have places like Pearson and whatever that are like, hey, yeah, we're going to develop this curriculum and the assessment that we're going to utilize. And if we shift away from that, if we're like, no, we don't have to give a standards based grade, or I mean, a standardized, high stakes standardized assessment. It's like, well, wait a minute, what do you mean? Like, no, I don't have to use your textbook and curriculum. Well, what do you mean? So, there's obviously a lot of those factors happening in the background, that continue to perpetuate this, even though we know it's wrong.
Mm,
And I jokingly told somebody the other day in a conversation, I said, well, what if we could help, places like Pearson and McGraw-Hill develop standards-based grading or mastery learning? I said, because then if they could profit off of it, they'd be all on board. I said, maybe that's where we need to focus.
listen, I'm with you. It's a business. Education is a business, no matter what name
It
it is.
is.
It is one of the biggest businesses there is, and that's a whole other topic that maybe we should get into at some point, maybe not this time, but yeah, I'm with you there. So listen, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about you as an individual and somebody who's, has that entrepreneurial spirit, and you're doing many different things. And this podcast, why I started it, is I just wanted to share with people stories of other individuals that have, that are doing interesting careers, that are just doing interesting things, and getting out of their comfort zone and really becoming these multidimensional people, because I feel like that's what the world needs more of. We're so caught up in being placed in boxes in this world that we forget that we are just made for so much more than that. And I feel like you're a great example of somebody who just tries different things. So first question would be, how did were you always like kind of a curious guy who's just always wanted to experiment with different things? Like, what stopped you from, or what pushed you, and instead of staying in the first job that you were doing, what pushed you to say, actually, let me change, and let me keep changing, and let me keep coming up with things? What were some of your motivations?
Yeah. So, I was that kid in school who, right, always was going after the A, right? I was the honor roll student. And for me, like, good was never good enough. I always wanted to be the best that I possibly could be. And so I was always, right, I was the overachiever, that kid who was in school early, in school late, just kind of. And I think that transpired over into this, as I started to realize that the world of education needed to shift. I just was never okay with saying, I know that there's a problem here, and I'm just going to accept it. You know, I as I mentioned, right, I was really great in school, but I was only great because I was operating in a system that was geared for me. So as my peers, as my brother, for example, as they struggled through school, it wasn't because I was better than them. It was just because that system was created for me. And I realized later on, and early on in my educational career, well, maybe if we start doing things differently in that system, it's not just student A who's successful, but student B and student C, and so on. And I made it my purpose to say, I can't be okay with just a handful of kids being successful. I know the potential that exists in all of these students, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that every single one of them is successful. And so that is what really drove me, because yeah, I started doing that in my classroom and it was working very well. And it's like, great, right? But then I noticed, well, wait a second, it's not happening in the rest of the school. How do I impact the rest of the school? Well, I know I'll go be an administrator, right? And so now I've been an administrator, for 8, 9 years. And okay, well, that's great. I'm doing these things in my school, but you know what? It's happening in other places. So how can I impact the other spaces, right? And so I launched, right, the podcast, and writing the book, and doing these workshops and speaking at conferences, just all over. And so, I mean, I guess that is what has driven me. This desire, it still exists. The issues that I'm trying to address still exist. And so I don't think I will ever, to be honest, I'll never be satisfied, because I don't know if we're ever going to address these. But that drives me to continue reaching into bigger places, so that way I could have much more of an impact. I'm now looking at how can I become a leader within the district, right, on a district level.
Mm.
So yeah, I don't think that is ever going to go away.
Mm. And I mean, that's the character we want in an educator and a leader of a school as well. So so I applaud you for that, for sure. Just somebody who's innovative and looking at the next thing, because I believe the best way to influence people is by just leading by example and practicing what they preach. So I think that's admirable. Do you have any particular like routines, habits that you implement on your daily basis in your life that help you manage, I'm sure, all the like ups and downs of education, because you're dealing with so many different factors throughout the day, and you have this, K through eighth grade, which is that's a tough audience right there.
Yeah. So I think the one thing that really helps is just taking time to reflect. And this is something I've been talking a lot about. Um, Kind of at the end of your day, just sitting back, and it's very easy to say, well, this didn't go right, this didn't go right. But identifying two things. One is a daily gratitude. What is something that I'm thankful for? Something that went well. And in that same vein, then recognizing that you've done your best, that you showed up, that you did your best, and that it's okay. I think it's easy for us as educators, maybe just people in general, if you care about what you're doing, to question, did I do enough today? And if you sit in that, it could eat away at you. And so I think for me, that's super important at the end of the day, to take a few minutes to just reflect, to say, what went well today? What is at least one thing that went well? And did I do my best? And if I did my very best, then I know I can go to sleep that night, and I'll be okay. Um, and I think the one other thing, right? And it's just, as we talk about functioning, it's really figuring out that life work balance. And I was that educator that prided myself on, I will be the first one in the building, I will be the last one to leave. You could email me at any given time and I will respond. You can call me. And that sounded great, right, within my school. But my wife and my kids, that wasn't so great for them,
Mhm.
because it's like, dad isn't always here. He's here, but he's not here.
Mm.
And so, you know, don't be afraid at the end of the day to say, okay, work is done for the day, right? Whatever you left, it'll be there tomorrow. It'll be okay, right? So be okay putting that pause, and going in to your home and doing what you need to do. My good friend, he's a principal not too far away from me. He said, if there's a crisis, right? If the building is burning down, if someone is, stranded on the side of the road, nobody's emailing you at that point, right? They're calling you. So why are you bothering to check your emails on the weekend? Like, the
Mm.
crisis isn't happening there. So it's okay. Like, I'm just telling you, because I used to be that guy, and this year I really have fallen hard into it. I don't even bring my computer from work home anymore. It sits on my desk at work. Like, you are not coming home. You are not bothering me and my family. And guess what? It's okay. Like the
Yeah.
building's still there. I'm still here. It's okay.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And also, it's also just as a leader, it's you have such an impact on those around you. So, and I think that there's also like this effect that is not always very obvious, but on your team if you do these sort of things, because if you're an individual who's always on and answering emails at odd hours of the day or early in the morning and these sort of things, it kind of puts your team under pressure, say, well, should I be like this? And not everybody wants to be like this. No, not everybody should be like this. Not everybody, like that's not the message we want to send, right? I mean,
Hmm.
burnout is one of the one of the biggest issues we have right now in the world, stress and loneliness and a lot of other mental health challenges that people have. So it's the last message we want to send. And in the corporate world, I always advise like managers, I said, listen, schedule your emails. If you really want to send that email, schedule it, send it the next day. Don't set an example that you're the kind of leader that's emailing at 10 p.m. at night or 4 a.m. in the morning, because then other people will feel pressure that that's the expectation.
Yeah, yeah. It's my I used to have to feel like I had to defend myself. Like, yeah, I'm gonna send it. You don't have to read it. And somebody said, well, why do you even have to send it? If you know we're not going to read it, then why are you even sending it? And I'm like, yeah, like
Yeah.
that's a good point.
Or even just schedule it, like schedule it for the next day or something.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a challenge many people have. And especially like if you're an overachiever and that kind of mentality, you kind of just, that's just how you operate and etc. So it's nice to hear that you're kind of reflecting on these things. I mean, I'm very much the same way. And I sometimes have to remind myself not to overdo, because I think also when you're passionate about what you're doing, you kind of forget that you're working because you just like what you do so much and it brings you so much joy that you forget that it does have an impact.
Hmm.
So I think as you said, kind of just taking a moment and if, expressing that gratitude and thinking about what went well is very essential, because it just grounds you and like keeps you in check essentially. So that's a great point. So tell me, I just have a couple more questions for you, but I'm curious, what is your day like as a principal? I'm sure it's a roller coaster, but what is your day?
So imagine that roller coaster that is on fire in the middle of an earthquake. No, I'm joking. Um, so it's never the same. It's I would say the ideal day. I really get to spend time with my staff and my students. Those are my ideal days. I'm sitting in classrooms. I'm connecting with kids at lunch or at recess. I'm in a meeting with my staff, but it's not a meeting. It's just dialoguing and conversations, checking in with them. Those are my ideal days. Just really bonding and connecting. As we said much earlier in this conversation, those soft skills, right? That is the part that I love the most. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk. Obviously, it's there's reports and paperwork and deadlines and all of those other things. And so when you're running a school, at least in my case, it's both sides, making sure that the instruction is happening on a high level so that way all kids are learning, but then it's also making sure, is the building running, all
Mhm.
those business aspects, right? Did that grant go through? Did those purchases get made? Like, is the building itself okay? Do we need a repair here or there? So it's a multitude of different hats. um but at the end of the day, I think, again, it's, you know am I making sure that everybody around me is successful? Right. I tell them all the time, I may be the so-called captain of the ship, but I can't steer it by myself. Right. So I need to make sure that you're successful so that way the school is successful. And it's only when you and the schools are successful that I'm successful. And so it's prioritizing every single day to say, what really do I have to do today, and moving things around, and oftentimes leaving things on that desk at the end of the day because it's like, hey, I didn't get to that because this other thing was more important. I'll get to it tomorrow. And so it's just a constant juggling of and prioritizing, those things that are important. But regardless of what is happening, you have to take time to connect. with the people in your building. I know I make a point every day. I do walkthroughs, and I just leave my office, I leave my stuff, and I go and I just spend time in classrooms. And it's not weird, you know, like the kids and the teachers, they're so accustomed to seeing me, it's no longer weird. So
Mm,
um I just think that's important as a principal, at least for me.
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Listen, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate you being here. I'm curious also where people can find you. Where do you do your podcasting? Where's the best way to kind of follow you and maybe get in touch with you, learn from you?
Yeah. So the podcast is called the Counter Narrative Podcast. I know your show is on Anchor, so is that, and you know, across of course all types of platforms. So you could find that. I am the co-host of a show called Inside the Principal's Office. So if you follow us at Inside Principal or follow School Rubric, and School Rubric I know has a global uh, footprint. So people, you know, from around the world might follow them. You could watch the show. It's the first and third Saturdays of every month. Except for this month, we're doing a fourth one because we're gonna only do one in November and December because of the holidays. And if you want to follow me and connect with me, the really the best place to do that is on Twitter. So you can follow me at underscore CW Consulting. And yeah, follow me. I'll follow you back. Message me. I will message you back. You know, join, you know, invite me to participate in tweet or Twitter chats or whatever it may be. That is the best place to connect. And of course, from there you can find all the links, but that is the best place if you actually want to engage with me. Find me on Twitter and let's connect.
Sounds good. And that's how we connected. And that's the beauty of social media. And I appreciate you taking the time and kind of, just sharing some of your thoughts and the things that you're doing in education. And again, I admire it. I hope there's more leaders like yourself who are kind of pushing the agenda forward in a way that makes sense for all of us and for the future generations. So thank you again for being here, and look forward to more content from you as well.
Thank you, Elena. Once again, just thank you for giving me this space.